If you've been following the recent headlines on teacher recruitment and retention, you'll know that the government statistics paint a grim picture of missed targets and schools finding it increasingly hard to find enough teachers. In September, the government decided to set up a new Workload Reduction Taskforce because ministers seem to believe that if they can reduce teachers' workload, then perhaps more people will sign up to become teachers and then remain in the profession once they get there. To help this new task force with their important work, I have devised 3 proposals to reduce teachers' workload, and I have 2 expert guests who are going to tell me whether my 3 proposals are useful or useless. Our guests are Becky Allen, co-founder and chief analyst of the teacher survey tool Tapp and professor of education at the University of Brighton, and James Zuccollo, the director of school workforce at the Education Policy Institute. I'm Tom Richmond, the director of the EDSK think tank, and to discover whether I have got the right plans to reduce teachers' workload, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast from the education and skills think tank EDSK that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including schools, colleges, universities and apprenticeships. You can find out more about EDSK's research at edsk.org or on Twitter at EDSK Think Tank.
Seeing as we are here to talk about teacher workload today, the obvious place to start is the research evidence on this issue. So, James, what do we actually know about the workload pressures facing teachers in England?
Well, Tom, I think the first thing to say is that it's very hard to know exactly what workload pressures are facing teachers because measuring workload turns out to be much harder than one would expect. Different approaches give different numbers of hours that teachers are working. Not all surveys are representative. Not all surveys capture only teachers. So this is a much fuzzier topic than one might expect. But I think what we can say from the many surveys that have been done of teachers' workload is that teachers work very long hours, probably about 50 hours a week, maybe a bit more for primary teachers. And the average across the UK for all jobs is only 36 hours. So during term time, there's no doubt teachers are working very hard, and senior leaders particularly so, much closer to 60 hours a week, which is extremely high compared to other professions. And often this has been blamed for the recruitment and retention problems that the profession's facing at the moment, and teachers often complain about their workload. But what is quite surprising, and I know Becky's done a lot of work on this, is that teachers' workload hasn't really changed for the past 25 years or so, which is about as long as we have data for. So whatever's going on that teachers are complaining about, and it's not that anyone doesn't believe teachers when they say their workload is overwhelming, it's probably not the number of hours they're working, despite that being very long. So the question is, what is it about workload that is such a problem? And I think we're learning more year by year, but at the moment, it seems that it's those tasks that seem to be stressful, that don't seem to contribute to pupils' learning, that don't seem to be meaningful to teachers that are so difficult. Those jobs like marking, like creating evidence for Ofsted, that are time-consuming, they're tedious, and don't seem to improve the learning of pupils. Those ones create a lot of stress, a lot of pressure for teachers, and those are the ones where I think there is a real problem. And those are the ones that all of these working groups over the past few years have been focused on trying to bring down, but I'm not sure there's good evidence that's worked so far.
Thank you, James. Well, no doubt spurred on by some of those statistics you've just mentioned, the government has indeed just launched their Workload Reduction Taskforce that has been set the goal of reducing working hours by 5 hours per week within 3 years, which seems perfectly reasonable. But Becky, this isn't the first teacher workload group we've seen created by government. I know you chaired a workload reduction group yourself a few years ago. We also had the Workload Challenge set up by then Education Secretary Nicky Morgan back in 2014. And I'm sure we could go back even further than that. So as someone who has been involved in this sort of initiative before, are you surprised or even worried that we are still having this conversation about teacher workload?
I'm not surprised we're still having the conversation about teacher workload, because I don't think these conversations ever really are capable of tackling the reasons why workload is high. And I think one of the basic reasons is the problem of teaching hours. We ask teachers to teach a relatively high number of hours in a system where we're expecting teachers to teach with actually relatively high curriculum autonomy and across an incredibly wide range of subjects and year groups. So, for example, where somebody, if you meet a maths teacher in America, they might introduce themselves as somebody who's teaching grade 8 algebra, and they'll teach the same thing multiple times every week. We don't have that model. We expect teachers to be able to teach 5, 6, 7 year groups. In the primary phase, we expect them to teach all subjects. And we expect them to move year groups. Anytime the head teacher wants them to move year groups, we expect them to do it. So when we're kind of dealing with that idea that we're teaching lots and lots of hours, where we have high autonomy, we're expected to be experts at an incredibly broad curriculum at any point in time, it's not really surprising that we can't tackle the workload problem. And so that's like my number one thing that we find it hard to talk about because it's expensive to fix. And then the other thing that's difficult is we've never really dealt with workload questions in relation to our accountability system. When we talk about accountability, we don't just mean the fact that we have an inspection system and we have performance tables. We mean the internal accountability that goes on within schools, where school leadership teams feel an obligation to hold teachers accountable and document what they are doing, and to some extent control what they're doing. And I think if we talk about the very long run story of how teaching has changed, and it's certainly changed a great deal since I left teaching now 20 years ago, is quite simply that teachers don't really have the kind of autonomy that I had. They're told what they have to do around curriculum planning, marking, feedback, assessment, and all of these kind of impositions might bring a burden in terms of documentation. They often also just bring fundamental inefficiencies. You're told you must mark with a particular frequency in a particular way, regardless of what you're teaching, your pedagogies, what the topic is, So it's inevitably inefficient when we try to impose these kind of standardizations on the workforce, in addition to all the evidencing that goes on now that never did used to go on around behaviour management, absences, safeguarding and so on. And all these things once upon a time were entirely absent from the system, in part because we just didn't have the data management infrastructure to ever record anything. So nothing was ever recorded. So, the technology that should have brought with it efficiencies in recording data actually just invented lots and lots of new tasks. But then before we move on, just to say something specific about these very strange working groups that get formed by DFE, because I chaired one of them. And the problems with them aren't just like the remit ultimately doesn't get to grips with what is the nature of the job. It thinks there's a thing called workload that we can fix independently of education policy. But also usually we just have the wrong people at the table. And as James said, one of the fundamental challenges we have is really understanding what is the job of a teacher. If I take a random teacher on a Tuesday, from the moment they woke up, from the moment they go to sleep, what is it that they're up to? And kind of acknowledging that, one, we don't really know the answers to these questions, and the complexity of why they're doing the things they're doing is quite hard to unpick. But secondly, it would be kind of useful to have a few of these people at the table if we're trying to have a conversation about the nature of those jobs, given we understand so little through data about the nature of their jobs. But that's not what happens, because actually if you have a DFE working group, suddenly most of the table has to get filled with people who think they have a right to be there, trade union officials and so on, policymakers and so on. And then the rest of the people at the table are people who have spare time to show up. And these are often, MAT CEOs, people who don't have any classes. The odd head teacher will turn up. You're not going to get a jobbing classroom teacher fitting in addition to their 22 hours a week of teaching, going down to sanctuary buildings to show up for a working group. So, just getting to grips with the descriptive reality of what is this job and why are teachers doing all this stuff that they're doing would seem to be a kind of useful starting point for a working group.
Well, given that perhaps lack of progress in understanding teacher workload over the past 20 years, this new task force might well have their work cut out, not least because they've only got a few months to make up their mind and report back to government in terms of what they recommend. So let's see if we can help them along with some of my potential solutions to teacher workload. Let's kick off with one solution which comes down to a single word: Ofsted. We've already had the Labour Party say they would seek to change at least the grading system that we use for school inspections and for college inspections and elsewhere. Many of the big teaching unions continue to complain about the impact of Ofsted inspections on teachers and leaders. And it's also worth saying that in January next year, we'll have a brand new chief inspector at Ofsted who may wish to take the inspectorate in a slightly different direction. Becky, you've mentioned accountability. Do you think that reforming Ofsted should be part of the plan for reducing teacher workload?
Perhaps. But I also think there's no version of Ofsted reform that's consistent with the 2-day short inspection that can reform workload. And the reason why is that when you do a 2-day inspection, you don't inspect the quality of what you observe in the school, because you can't observe anything in 2 days. In fact, they do it in less than a day. So they're in there actually doing active inspection for maybe like 5 hours or so. So you can't observe anything. So you heavily have to rely on what the school says to you or what the school shows you. And all we see with every version of the inspection framework, the rules around what they say they're going to look at, is that they invent new versions of evidencing what plausible learning might be taking place at the school. We had a long period where it was kind of making up fake data, and that led to a workload of its own that I was associated with trying to sort of reduce. And so Amanda Spielman quite rightly came in and said, let's stop making up fake data. And she said, let's just focus on the quality of the curriculum. But of course, they can't observe the quality of the curriculum because they're not there for long enough. So what do they observe? Well, they observe curriculum maps, curriculum documents, documents about curriculum intent. They observe what's going on in the students' books because they can't view learning over a period of time. So they start flicking through the books. Suddenly it becomes critical that teachers are all marking and providing feedback within books in a meaningful way so that inspectors can observe that there's a meaningful process of formative assessment taking place in the schools. So a new inspector could recognise this and he could come in, he could think of another way of observing school quality, but it's always going to have to involve documents or just hearsay of what the schools choose to tell them, which isn't particularly reliable, unless we just have really long inspections where we actually truly find out what's going on in schools, and we can't afford to do that. So, I mean, that's my incredibly sort of pessimistic, I'm afraid, perspective on Ofsted.
James, let's find out if you're any more optimistic. Would reforming Ofsted inspections be at or near the top of your list of ways to reduce teacher workload?
I'm sorry to say I agree with almost everything Becky said there. I think the thing about Ofsted reform is that reform creates workload on its own. That when the use of internal data was banned by Amanda Spielman, as Becky said, and instead curriculum documents and evidence of sequencing needed to be created, that was a huge burden for schools to create all of that documentation, to show inspectors, to make sure it's up to date, to make sure that people's books reflect the sequencing of the curriculum that's in the school's policies. And any changes to Ofsted inspection framework are going to involve different evidence that will need to be collected, which will then create more workload. So while it's certainly the case that schools under Ofsted pressure do have a low well-being among their staff, among their leaders, they feel that pressure and it's very difficult for them. It's not obvious to me that, as Becky pointed out, without inspections that can actually look at what's going on within a school, they'll significantly reduce workload. And actually, I think the things you pointed to that's between Ofsted and the teachers, the leader is almost the most important part there for thinking about teacher workload. Because when I think about workload, I suppose what we really mean here is teachers' well-being, their motivation, not just the number of hours they're working, but how do they feel about those hours? How does it affect their stress levels, their performance at schools and their lives? And the school leader stands between Ofsted and those teachers. The school leader is the one putting the pressure on teachers to create that evidence base. And I think what's quite surprising is that great school leaders don't appear to get much better Ofsted inspections on average, but they do seem to make their staff much happier. Their staff quit less, their staff are absent less often. So I do wonder if there is something we can do to improve leadership training to create a buffer between Ofsted and teachers and reduce the pressure upon them.
Very interesting suggestion. Okay, so sounds like a bit of a thumbs down for my first proposal for reducing teacher workload. Let's try another one, shall we? Maybe if we want to reduce teacher workload, we should just forget about what teachers do in the classroom and spend more time and possibly more money on giving teachers more support outside the classroom with non-teaching activities. Perhaps we should recruit more teaching assistants to take some of the workload burden off teachers, or maybe we should invest more in special needs provision and specialist staff to again free up those classroom teachers to get back to teaching and learning. James, you've already hinted at something like this. So what do you think? If we want to reduce teachers' workload, should we just forget about school teachers for a moment and invest far more in those staff who work alongside teachers?
Well, I think it's absolutely right to say that schools have taken on a huge amount of additional activities beyond teaching their pupils over the last 15 years or so since the financial crisis. The cuts to local government spending, the increases in the cost of living mean that schools are doing ever more to support their students and teachers are doing ever more to support their students. So, for example, I think when we surveyed in 2018, a quarter of local authorities said they decommissioned or no longer provided any services related to young people's mental and emotional well-being. Rates of poverty are rising. We know from NHS surveys that young people with mental health difficulties are most likely to approach their teacher for support because they know and trust them. But teachers don't feel equipped to deal with these sorts of issues, and schools don't have the funding to have specialist staff to deal with these issues. Those used to be in local authorities and other support services, but increasingly those services are either missing or the bar for access to them for getting that EHCP plan or that CAMS referral is getting higher and higher. So fewer and fewer students can access those specialist services and the burden falls upon teachers. And that doesn't just take a huge amount of teachers' time, but it's incredibly emotionally taxing for teachers to have to deal with the problems that children are facing without the support from specialist services. So yes, I do think that improving those services and allowing teachers and schools to focus on teaching and learning rather than supporting students through other difficulties they may have in life would make teachers' jobs a lot easier.
Okay, Becky, what do you make of my proposal? Do you think there is a strong case for trying to reduce workload by investing more in non-teaching and support staff?
I think there is a strong case for doing it, for workload reasons and actually just for other reasons. The thing that I feel conflicted about is when we get down to the policy question of who should do it and what should sit inside the schooling system, what should sit inside the healthcare system, and what should sit inside social services. Because we've seen schools who've managed to raise lots of money, they're London schools backed by charities, get to the point where they have become de facto social services providers for local families and have pursued this kind of all-encompassing model where the school becomes the one-stop shop for the family and all of their welfare needs beyond education. And in some respects, that can feel really appealing because ultimately the schools are there. And as they know the families and they know the needs of the children and the children come to them when they have needs. The thing that I feel conflicted about is if schools do take on these duties in a kind of dynamic political model, to what extent do we set up future crisis for the education system where future governments then slowly shrink the cash that's associated with these services going through the education budget and then creating a pushback of pressures onto the education system. And then these kind of just basic questions about like, to what extent do we want to increase the complexity of what a school is and what it's supposed to do for us? It's hard enough just getting to grips with the idea that we're trying to regulate a system that's involved in student learning. But if we essentially are now saying it's like all family well-being that we're trying to regulate within the education system, I get nervous about the extent to which we're setting ourselves up a set of problems that become in the future very hard for the education system to manage. So I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I think we should look carefully at those choices around alternative choices of conceiving, adolescent mental health services as being well-funded drop-in services that are situated somewhere else in the community and have a clear mandate, clear ring-fence funding, clear targets in terms of what they're supposed to achieve. And that's the thing I feel very uncertain and conflicted about what I would do if I was a Labour government trying to look at these policies, which I know they are at the moment.
Okay, so perhaps some potential in that idea, but it raises some quite big questions about how you would go about it rather than whether you should go about it. Okay then. My third and final proposal for today in terms of reducing teacher workload is not so much a proposal as an observation about how much the world has changed since November last year when ChatGPT was launched. Becky, I saw you give a fascinating presentation on how ChatGPT and other similar AI tools, how much of an impact they're already having on teachers and teaching. And I know you've done some polling at Teacher Tapp on this subject. So has the teacher workload issue been solved, Becky, by ChatGPT? If the goal of the government's new task force is to reduce working hours by 5 hours a week, has ChatGPT already done task force work for them?
Well, let me say I'm far more optimistic that ChatGPT is going to make progress than the DFE working group. Let's talk about what we already know. We already know that about 4 in 10 teachers are actively using ChatGPT for their schoolwork at the moment. So it's not the future, it's here right now and it's being used. We know it's being used extensively for curriculum and resource planning. And what's nice about the way you can use it as a teacher is it allows you to maintain the autonomy and the choices and the thinking around conceptual thinking around how you want to teach tomorrow's class, but whilst having a buddy to have a conversation with and to provide you with ideas and help you with some of the more kind of menial resource creation that you have to do. And I think that's why teachers like using it. It's materially different to the idea of just providing curriculum plans and saying, there you go, use that, where the fundamental problem is that you have to, as a teacher, think through how you're going to do the thing, in a sense reimagine it in your mind in order to do it. So that's what they like about it. The big promise of the future is, will it ever get to the point where it can mark students' work? And there's a huge range of opinion about where we get to and the extent to which it will be able to mark student work in the future. From people who think that ultimately it can never be reliable enough because it hallucinates, because it has systematic reasons why it will give undesirable responses, and the group of people who say it can get to the point where it's good enough to do low stakes marking. I must admit, I am largely an optimist on this, and I'm someone who uses it extensively in my work because I do a lot of qualitative analysis and so on. What I think will be fascinating for the profession as a whole is the extent to which it alters the nature of the teaching job differentially for different types of teachers. And the reason why it's going to do this is because these large language models suit some subjects better than others. They work so well in subjects that are largely language-based, where there's kind of uncontested, generally agreed, and widely known and used knowledge out there, so that the chances it's coming back and saying things that are consistent with sensible things we would say as humans is high. That's why, for example, we're seeing it's science teachers more than anyone else who's making so much progress with using it, because school-based science is largely natural language-based. And if you're going to try and use it for analysis of things like modern novels for English literature, well, just forget it. Like, it's just going to madly hallucinate, right? So we're getting these very differential experiences. And it's kind of reminiscent of what we saw in, if you think of it like the early world of AI and technology improvement, where we saw radical changes in how maths teaching has taken place in schools already, with nearly all secondary schools making widespread use of auto-marking, homework platforms. If they want to, they can just buy off-the-shelf learning platforms and so on. All of that happened in maths. And I think we're going to see it happen in some other subjects as well. But it's not going to be in all subjects. And as a consequence, there's going to be these massive inequalities between teachers and schools, between those who are still having to set work, set homework, mark it, work in this intensive way, and those who are either buying in commercial products that are using large language models or directly using them themselves to speed up the rate at which they can do their teaching work. And that will inevitably bring conflicts, because why should English literature teachers be spending so many hours marking when actually we get to the point when maths and science teachers are not doing it anymore? And the nature of teaching early years and primary isn't likely to change as much just because of the nature of the children. So, thinking about the future politics of the teaching profession, we say you're all doing the same job, but are you all doing the same job? For me, those things are kind of not being spoken about much at the moment, and are going to be really hard to manage.
Fascinating insights. James, are you as excited as Becky about the possibilities offered by AI tools, or are there any reasons to be cautious going forward in terms of teacher workload and the teacher workforce?
I think I'm generally a terrible tech optimist, actually. So, yes, I do agree with most of that. I suppose my caution is that workload among teachers, as we talked about before, hasn't changed for quite a long time in total. There have been a lot of technological changes over the last 30 years for teaching. There's been the creation of a lot more materials for teachers, support services for teachers, as Becky said, off-the-shelf services for assessment, for formative assessment, summative assessment, and so on. And yet teachers seem to be working a similar number of hours and seem to be reporting that they're more stressed today than they were several years ago. And there are questions about why that is and how much of it is reporting. But nonetheless, stress levels don't appear to have gone down among teachers. So while I've no doubt that teachers will be employing this and doing their jobs better and better, I think that we don't have good evidence that that improved productivity that we hope for will lead to lower levels of stress, lower anxiety, and less workload for teachers. So I'm not confident that it's going to solve any recruitment or retention problems for us, even as it might perhaps improve the lives of pupils and their learning.
Very interesting. Just in terms of who should potentially be driving this forward, you both see the potential in these AI tools and large language models. But just this week, we've had the Department for Education say they're going to put £2 million of taxpayers' money into Oak National Academy, which is the state-funded online school, as part of a pledge to provide every teacher with a personalised AI lesson planning assistant. And this comes off the back of a pilot in terms of AI-powered quiz builders and lesson planners that the DfE has already tested. Becky, when you hear about a new wave of government-funded AI lesson planning assistants, does your optimism still hold, or do you think this is the wrong space for government to be operating in?
Yeah, government doesn't have a great track record, does it, when it comes to innovation and technological products? So I don't mind that they've done this, and I also don't think that Oak will be the long-term winner of this world. When we talk about planning and quiz-making assistants, we're talking about relatively kind of thin additional layers sitting on top of large language models. And I think that it's going to become an incredibly competitive international market of people providing that type of service for teachers, to the point where Oak could do it, but anyone else, any number of commercial providers will also do it. I also don't think that's where we end up. And the reason why I don't think that is where we end up is that I think the nature of what you need in different subjects looks very different. And so I think you see this initial wave of kind of genericism where we're just trying to provide very cheap, simple tools to help teachers interact with a large language model. And then I think we move towards layers of greater sophistication where people build subject specialist platforms. Because ultimately it's all very well saying, I'm going to help you build a quiz, but whether or not you even want to build a multiple choice assessment is a function of what subject you're teaching, and what they look like in different subjects is incredibly different. And so at least my perceptions at the moment is the winners in the end will create really good subject specialist tools in the same way that ultimately, and those will emerge by the way out of the commercial market, because in part that's where the expertise is. Government doesn't employ anyone who knows about anything about teaching any individual subject, so how can they really do this? And it's a big endeavour. And you look ultimately at what happened in the end with maths, and both in the US and in the UK, how did maths learning tools get incorporated into the classroom? And it happened through individual commercial innovation in highly competitive markets where eventually some winners played out. And those winners weren't receiving government money, because the winners were the people who had to just closely attend to what the schools needed and wanted and what the teachers needed and wanted, because they had to persuade them to cough up the money. And that kind of commercial imperative to build the thing that teachers and schools want like not what we think they want, is the thing that, like, my instincts are ends up winning out. Like, to get to the point where a teacher pays money or a school pays money for your product, that means you've done something that's really genuinely useful for them. And that has to be our goal if we're trying to work within the system that we do employ teachers and they're still at the front of the room. It kind of has to be a little bit about them, not just about what government thinks, education should look like.
Okay, we are approaching the end of this episode, so I have one final question for our two guests to wrap up our discussion today. Clearly, teacher workload is a complicated issue with lots of drivers and factors that sit behind it. That said, when the government announced their new task force, they said that, quote, "We want to make sure that teaching is an attractive career choice, which is why we're committed to tackling unnecessary workload for teachers and leaders." So in the government's mind, at least, reducing workload is a crucial part of addressing the recruitment and retention crisis facing many schools. So my question is, should we look at efforts to reduce teacher workload as being central to getting more teachers into teaching and to keep them there longer? Or is it just wishful thinking to say that workload will make an impact on the recruitment and retention crisis? James, you've hinted at your answer already, but what about your verdict here? Is reducing teacher workload the silver recruitment bullet that we've all been waiting for?
I think there's two parts to this, aren't there? One is this a silver bullet? Would it fix things? And the second is, can we do it? And on the latter question, I'm very skeptical that the government will be able to significantly reduce workload. I went to the DfE's page for all the workload guidance it's issued over the last 8 years. There are 32 items of policy, research, guidance. There was the workload challenge in 2015, the action plan in 2017, an advisory group in 2019, the recruitment and retention strategy, a new task force. And over that period, with a lot of people working extremely hard to try to reduce workload in central government, I don't think we have any evidence that they've significantly succeeded. And recruitment and retention problems have just got worse over that period. So I do not think that we have the capacity in central government through these sorts of endeavours to try to significantly affect teachers' workload. If we could do that, would it make a huge difference? Well, I think it might make some difference to teacher retention if we're able to improve the quality of their lives and their job satisfaction by reducing the make work they had to do to generate evidence that they don't think contributes to pupils' learning and makes their jobs less meaningful. However, I think the bigger picture is that teachers' pay has been falling dramatically behind other graduate professions' pay at the same time as we've struggled to recruit teachers and more teachers have left. And unless we solve that problem first, then I don't think addressing workload will have a huge impact. So I think there's no cost-free way to improve the retention recruitment of teachers in England.
Thank you, James. Becky, could reducing teacher workload have a material impact on recruitment and retention in schools?
Yeah, so like James, I just really don't see this as cost-free. Not least that I think unless we reform accountability within the system, I don't think we can sort it out without reducing teaching hours. And that's really, really expensive to do. And it also might not be the best thing to do, particularly if we care about the retention of our less experienced teachers. So on Teacher Tapp, we often ask these questions where we say, kind of hypotheticals, would you rather have an extra £1,000 on your salary, or would you rather have, a reduction in the number of hours you teach each week? And for inexperienced teachers, they nearly always pick the cash. And that really plays to what James said about salaries. Inexperienced teachers who don't have additional classroom responsibilities, managerial responsibilities, are just not that well paid. They're struggling financially with the cost of living, particularly if they live in the south of England, and they will just take cash every time, even though they're working horrifically long working hours and they're miserable. And so that points to the idea that, perhaps salaries are really important for retention. I think workload's somewhat important for retention. I'm not sure how important it is for recruitment, and perhaps this plays to the idea that James opened with, that we've always had these long working hours, and what's changed is the nature of our perception of how we feel about these working hours and how that plays out in the public sense of what is the morale of the profession, but also that private sense of everybody who's thinking about becoming a teacher know someone who's a teacher, because they're 2% of the workforce. We all know teachers. And unfortunately, at the moment, when you meet a teacher and say, hey, I'm thinking about becoming a teacher, should I do it? At the moment, teachers say, no, stay clear. There's nothing good about this job. Stay away from the profession. And for recruitment, until we fix that kind of messaging that's consistently going out from the profession, that is it about working hours? Yeah, it's somewhat about workload, but it's more about the nature of the workload, the way they've been treated by leadership, the way they feel they've been treated by government, and trying to generate a sense of pride in our profession and a sense that this is a job that they feel proud to be doing. They feel a high degree of empowerment that they can do a good job in helping students learn. And there's a whole load of complex issues around how we achieve that, and they're not workload questions.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. My thanks to Becky and James for all their insights and ideas today on how to reduce teacher workload. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do leave us a good rating on iTunes or Spotify so that our podcast can reach even more education enthusiasts. And don't forget to hit subscribe to get all our past episodes, and also to make sure you join us when we next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.